I feel that way sometimes, definitely. Or more often, do we think about why we're here and what legacy we want to leave? Over and over again, we see that when people work on something with a larger purpose, something greater than themselves, they perform at a higher level. So I think we need to begin asking ourselves, does the place where we work aspire to something grander than simply hitting the numbers? Do the places that, those of you who are designers, allow people to pursue a purpose? And that purpose doesn't have to be, your purpose doesn't have to be solving global warming or ending world hunger. I mean, it's cool if you want to do that, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be giving people a more comfortable place to sit, a better light to read by, a cooler pattern on the wall. But without purpose, and again, Motivation 2.0 does not recognize purpose. It doesn't exist in that scheme. It's hard to do amazing things. So here we have it. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Those are the three, those are at the heart of true motivation, especially the motivation that we need to do amazing work. Now, this sounds fairly easy. It's rooted in the science. It makes intuitive sense. But for designers, like many of you, for architects, like many of you, for others in right-brain professional service work, there's one obstacle standing in the way of these Elysian fields of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. One horrific satanic obstacle standing in the way. And the best name for this obstacle comes from a designer in Chicago named Jim Coudal. He calls it the tyranny of the client. Now, I find this especially compelling because I've been one of Jim's clients. What he means is that when you do, it's a business model question in many ways. When you do work for hire, you give up a certain amount of control, sometimes a huge amount of control to your tyrannical client. And that can be frustrating, right? Now, one of the things that science shows us about motivation is that people typically have two responses to being controlled. There are two responses to being controlled. Compliance or defiance. So when the client is controlling, you know this, you can go two ways. You can you can comply. You can throw up your hands and do what the client wants. Or you can defy. You can throw up one finger and lose the business. But I think you've got another option. You see some of this on the floor here today. Coudal has proposed option one. Okay? You can become the client. That is, those of you who are doing work for hire can migrate to creating products and processes and businesses that you design and sell on the open market to lots of customers rather than one client. And Coudal Partners has done this really in some really cool way with notebooks and cool political T-shirts and professional-grade DVD packages. And you see it now with what Michael Sylvester calls productized architecture out there. That's a very good approach because it gives you the autonomy. You don't see the autonomy, you retain the autonomy. But this approach raises a troubling philosophical question, especially for architects and designers. This approach raises a very troubling philosophical question for architects and designers. And Jim Coudal puts it like this. When you are your own client, who are you going to make fun of after work at the bar? So I think you've got a second option. And that is that you can educate your clients. They don't know all this cool stuff about autonomy, mastery, and purpose, and you ought to teach them. You ought to show them that's how you do your best work, and you ought to bring out their own autonomy, their own mastery, and their own purpose, make them part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And on that, you have a role model. You have a very effective role model. Two, actually. Two role models that actually, in some ways, step from the pages of Dwell, or at least step from the pages of modernist architecture and design. Charles and Ray Eames. Now, I know there are some of you who roll your eyes at the mention of their names yet again. But here's the thing. They're pretty awesome. I mean, they are. They have their own postage stamp. Okay, that's just awesome. And if you read about how they worked, it's actually quite inspiring. Now, as you know, they did everything. Furniture and graphics and museum exhibitions and houses and sculptures and more furniture. And through it all, they worked for clients. They worked for clients like IBM and Polaroid and USIA and others. But they embodied, way ahead of their times, this different approach to motivation. So let's start with autonomy. They sure as heck exercised autonomy over time to create their famous lounge chair. You see several of them out there. They took several years to get it right. Charles said repeatedly that constraints were fine, but compromises were not. And they needed to control their time in order to avoid compromises. Okay, let's talk about autonomy over task. Autonomy over task. This is a story that's not well known, but I find it quite inspiring. I find it A, shocking, B, inspiring. In the 1950s, Anheuser-Busch asked the Eameses to redesign the Budweiser logo. They were getting all kinds of work in graphics and a whole array. Anheuser-Busch says, we want you to redesign the Budweiser logo. Okay? So Charles and Ray spent several months studying the logo's look, its feel, its semiotics. Then they went back to their client and they said, we've examined this carefully. The logo you have now is actually really good. It's exactly what you need. You don't want to hire us. Saw a few gasps in the audience on that one. They refused to take on a task that wasn't worth doing. Now, do you think in either case that press for autonomy hurt their reputation or hindered their long-term ability to earn a living? Or go to mastery? As some of you know, they were obsessed with process. So much so that early in their marriage, they had in this tiny little apartment, they had this giant contraption called the Kazam machine that would mold the plywood for their chair. So they have this crappy little apartment, and they've got this giant plywood molding vending machine there. Why do they do that? Because they didn't want to only conceive the stuff, they wanted to make the stuff, because making the stuff helped them get better and better and better at what they did. That's mastery. And finally, there is purpose. For them, if you look at their work, if you look at how they approach things, for them, design wasn't about prettification or ornamentation. It was about need. It was about others' needs. And the way they saw it, the designer wasn't a genius and the client an idiot. Instead, Charles said the designer was the host and the client was the guest. It's a very different relationship. And if you combine those two, addressing needs and being a host, design becomes in many ways an act of public service. It brings it all together. And this is something that Charles said. He said, eventually, everything connects. And I think that this is truly one of those times in which everything is connecting. Think about it. At the end of this decade, in the trough of this recession, in the wake of all the scandals, we're realizing that the old operating system doesn't work. We need an upgrade. Badly. And the good news is that we don't have to invent it. We don't have to make it ourselves. It's out there. These brilliant scientists have built it for us. An operating system based on this third drive. A drive that goes beyond staying alive. A drive that goes beyond chasing carrots and sticks. And moves us closer to, I think, to what it truly means to be human. Everything connects. Because today, the science tells us what we know in our hearts. That we know in our hearts. That we're not destined to be passive and inert, but wired to be active and engaged. That the highest experiences in our lives aren't when we're trying to get a big check or win a fancy award, but when we do great, meaningful, lasting work. And I'm convinced that if we bring our understanding of motivation into the 21st century and get past this lazy, dangerous, and empirically wrong reliance on carrots and sticks, I really believe we can strengthen our businesses, elevate our lives, and maybe change the world. And I really do think that it's you, the great design minds of our time, who have the ability to make that happen. Thanks very much.